What you are about to watch is not the story America tells about itself. This is the architecture beneath the myth, the machinery behind the monument. A documentary about how a discovered territory became the most dominant force in human history. Not through destiny, but through decisions that compounded across centuries into something no single generation intended to create. This is not a celebration. This is not a condemnation. This is an examination of power in its purest form. How it's built, how it sustains itself, and what happens when the systems that created dominance begin to strain under their own weight. Part 1. Discovery and Promise. The land was never empty. That lie was the first brick in the foundation. When European ships reached what would become America, they found millions of people living in complex societies. But the narrative required emptiness, required virgin soil, required the psychological space for a new beginning, unburdened by old-world hierarchies and blood-soaked histories. So the narrative was constructed, a new world, waiting to be claimed by those brave enough to cross an ocean. The genius of early American mythology wasn't in denying the violence of displacement. It was in framing that violence as progress. Manifest destiny wasn't just expansion. It was expansion as moral imperative. The land stretched westward, and so must civilization. To stop was to betray God's plan. To hesitate was weakness. The psychological framework justified everything that followed. But beneath the religious language and democratic idealism, something else was being built. A machine that would prove far more enduring than the philosophies used to justify it. The Constitutional Convention of 1787 wasn't a gathering of pure idealists. It was a negotiation between competing economic interests, regional powers, and men who understood that the revolution they just won could easily collapse into chaos or tyranny. They were building a government strong enough to enforce contracts, protect property, and project power, but constrained enough to prevent any single faction from dominating the others. The compromise was elegant and brutal. Slavery was embedded into the constitutional mathematics. 3/5 of enslaved people would count for representation, giving Southern states disproportionate power while denying those people any rights. The Senate would give small states equal voice with large ones, creating permanent structural imbalances. The Electoral College would prevent direct democracy, filtering popular will through layers of institutional control. This wasn't accidental. This was the design. America was born as a republic that feared its own citizens as much as it feared foreign kings. The founders created a system that could expand, that could absorb new territories and populations, that could grow in wealth and power, but that would always contain internal brakes against rapid change. And then came the economic engine. Cotton. The Industrial Revolution created insatiable demand for cotton, and America had land, enslaved labor, and the Mississippi River to move it all to market. By the 1850s, America produced more than half the world cotton. The textile mills of England ran on fiber picked by enslaved hands in Georgia and Mississippi. Global capital flowed toward American agriculture. The South grew rich. The North grew rich, financing and transporting Southern cotton.
That say
Everyone
black
involved
trans
convinced
lives
themselves
matter.
that the system was natural and inevitable. But systems built on exploitation contain their own contradictions. And contradictions, given enough time, become crises. Part 2. Foundation of Power. The Civil War wasn't just about slavery. It was about which vision of American power would dominate. An agrarian aristocracy built on enslaved labor, or an industrial financial system built on wage labor and capital accumulation. The North won, and in winning, it didn't just free the enslaved. It locked in the industrial model as America's future. The Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869, wasn't just transportation. It was the physical manifestation of a continental economy. Raw materials from the West, manufactured goods from the East, everything moving on steel rails protected by federal power. Banks in New York began to rival banks in London. Corporations, legal fictions granted personhood by courts, became the dominant economic actors. The Gilded Age wasn't called that ironically. Wealth concentrated at speed that shocked even European observers. Robber barons built monopolies in oil, steel, railroads, finance. They didn't just control industries. They controlled senators, governors, entire state legislatures. This was the era when America's institutional architecture crystallized into something unprecedented. Not quite capitalism in the European sense, because the government and corporations were too intertwined. Not quite socialism, because private profit remained the organizing principle. Something hybrid, something that would later be called the American system. The genius was in the legal structure. Corporations could raise capital from thousands of investors, limiting individual risk while pooling massive resources. They could lobby for favorable regulations for tariffs that protected their industries, for land grants that subsidized their expansion. They could hire private armies, literally, to break strikes and suppress labor organizing. And when that violence became too visible, they could pressure the government to send federal troops instead. Meanwhile, waves of immigrants poured into American cities. Italians, Irish, Germans, Eastern Europeans, Jews fleeing pogroms. They came believing the promise that in America, anyone could rise through hard work. Some did, most didn't. But the myth was powerful enough that it sustained itself across generations. Your father worked in a factory. Maybe you could own a shop. Maybe your children could go to college. The promise wasn't entirely false. Social mobility existed, but it existed within a system designed to channel ambition into forms that reinforced the existing order. You could get rich, but only by accepting the rules of corporate capitalism. You could gain political power, but only by working within a two-party system that both parties agreed would never threaten property rights or financial control. And then came 1898, the Spanish-American War, America's first imperial moment. Not the first time it had expanded. That had been happening since the founding, but the first time it openly acquired overseas territories. The Philippines, Puerto Rico, Guam. The first time America held colonies it would never admit to statehood. This was the turning point most historians underplay. This was when America stopped being a continental power and started becoming a global one. Not because it wanted to, the public was deeply divided about imperialism, but because the economic logic demanded it. American factories were producing more than domestic markets could consume. They needed foreign markets, needed coaling stations for the Navy, needed territories to compete with European empires. The machinery of dominance was no longer optional. It was structural. Part 3, the turning points. 2 world wars transformed America from a rising power into the dominant power. And the transformation happened so quickly that the American public never fully processed what had changed. World War I was supposed to be Europe's problem. America entered late in 1917, and by then the great powers had already bled themselves nearly to death. American troops and American loans tipped the balance. And when the war ended, America was the world's largest creditor. Europe owed America billions. The global financial center began shifting from London to New York. But America withdrew, rejected the League of Nations, retreated into a modified isolationism that pretended the rest of the world didn't matter. The 1920s roared with speculation in excess, and then the entire financial system collapsed. The Great Depression revealed something crucial about American power. It was global whether Americans wanted it to be or not. When American banks failed, European banks failed. When American demand dried up, global trade collapsed. The interconnected economy that had been built over decades couldn't be switched off by political will. Franklin Roosevelt's response, the New Deal, wasn't socialism. It was state capitalism designed to save capitalism from itself. Government spending on infrastructure, jobs programs, financial regulations that prevented the worst abuses. Not a revolution, but a controlled adaptation. The system bent, but didn't break. And then came the war that would define the century. World War II was different. This time, America entered after Pearl Harbor with full public support. This time, American industrial capacity became the deciding factor. Factories that had made cars started making tanks, planes, ships. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. The economy, depressed for a decade, suddenly ran at full capacity producing weapons. But more important than the military victory was what came after. Bretton Woods, 1944. The Allied powers gathered to redesign the global financial system, and America dictated the terms. The dollar would be tied to gold. Other currencies would be tied to the dollar. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank would enforce this system. Marshall Plan aid would rebuild Europe on American terms, with American loans, creating permanent dependence on American markets. This was the architecture of the American century. Not formal empire like the British had built, but something more subtle and more comprehensive. Financial dominance. Military alliances that looked like partnerships but operated under American leadership. Cultural exports. Hollywood, jazz, Coca-Cola. That made American norms seem universal. The Cold War completed the transformation. Nuclear weapons made total war unthinkable, so competition moved to proxy conflicts, economic aid, ideological struggle. America built a network of military bases on every continent. The CIA overthrew governments. Iran in 1953, Guatemala in 1954, others that threatened American economic interests. Not because they were communist necessarily, but because they threatened the system. The threat of Soviet competition justified everything. Domestic surveillance, massive defense, spending, interventions in distant countries. The national security state grew into a permanent structure, operating with minimal oversight, classifying its activities, building capabilities that would outlast the enemy that supposedly justified them. And here's what's crucial. This wasn't a conspiracy. This was a system responding to its own logic. Each decision made sense in isolation. Each expansion of power seemed necessary given the threat. But the aggregate effect was an empire that governed through economic pressure, military presence, and the constant threat of exclusion from the American-led order. By 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, America had won. Complete victory, the unipolar moment. No rival, no constraint, no alternative vision of how the world should be organized. And in that moment of absolute triumph, the seeds of the current crisis were planted. Part 4. The Superpower Era. Unipolarity was supposed to bring peace. Instead, it brought hubris. The 1990s were the era of triumphalist capitalism. Markets would spread democracy. The internet would create global connection. History had ended, according to the fashionable theory, and liberal democratic capitalism was the final form of human government. America wasn't just powerful, it represented the inevitable future. But the machinery of American dominance had developed appetites that peace couldn't satisfy. Defense contractors needed new threats to justify their budgets. Intelligence agencies needed new missions. The military needed new doctrines for a world without peer competitors. And Wall Street, deregulated and unleashed, needed new frontiers for speculation. The financial system that had been regulated after the Depression was systematically dismantled. Glass-Steagall repealed. Derivatives markets left unregulated. Investment banks allowed to leverage themselves to unprecedented ratios. The logic was simple. Markets self-regulate, government intervention distorts efficiency, and America's financial sector was too sophisticated to repeat past mistakes. September 11th, 2001 provided the external threat the system needed. The response wasn't proportional, it was systemic. 2 decades of war in Afghanistan and Iraq. The Patriot Act, Warrant Surveillance, extraordinary rendition, Guantanamo. The entire architecture of counterterrorism built on legal theories that stretched executive power to its absolute limits. The cost was staggering. Trillions of dollars. Thousands of American lives. Hundreds of thousands of foreign lives. Entire countries destabilized. But the wars continued not because they were winnable, but because the system for waging them had become permanent. Defense budgets that couldn't shrink. Alliances that demanded presence. Threats that multiplied faster than they could be eliminated. Meanwhile, The financial crisis of 2008 revealed that the deregulated economy was unstable at its core. Subprime mortgages packaged into securities and sold to pension funds. Ratings agencies giving AAA ratings to toxic assets. Banks so large that their failure would collapse the entire system. The government response validated the darkest cynicism. Banks were bailed out. Executives kept their bonuses. Homeowners lost everything. The message was clear. The financial system was too important to fail, and everyone else was expendable. This was the moment when the promise fractured completely. For 2 centuries, America had offered a bargain. Accept the system, work within it, and you'll have opportunity. But now the opportunity was revealed as conditional. If you were too big, you'd be protected. If you were ordinary, you'd absorb the losses. The political response was predictable. Populism on the left and right. Anger at institutions. Distrust of expertise. A fracturing of the consensus that had held since World War II. One America that benefited from globalization, financialization, and technology. Another America that watched factories close, towns hollow out, and opportunities vanish while being told the economy was strong. And internationally, the cracks began showing. Russia, humiliated in the 1990s, began pushing back. China, integrated into the global economy, started building its own infrastructure for power projection. Alternative payment systems to bypass dollar dominance. Belt and Road Initiative to create economic dependence. Military modernization to contest American presence in the Pacific. The unipolar moment was over. But the systems built during that moment remained increasingly expensive and increasingly questioned. Part 5. The future tension. America today is the most powerful nation on Earth by nearly every metric. Its military remains unmatched. Its currency still dominates global trade. Its technology companies shape how billions of people communicate. Its universities, its research institutions, its cultural exports remain globally influential. And yet something fundamental has shifted. The confidence is gone. The certainty that American-led globalization benefits everyone has collapsed. The belief that democracy and capitalism naturally reinforce each other has been shaken. The assumption that America can afford to be everywhere, all the time, indefinitely, that assumption is being tested. The internal tensions are multiplying faster than institutions can process them. Political polarization that makes basic governance difficult. Wealth inequality at levels not seen since the Gilded Age. Infrastructure decay visible in crumbling bridges and unreliable power grids. Educational stagnation while other nations invest heavily. A healthcare system that costs more than any other while delivering worse outcomes for average citizens. These aren't just policy failures. They're symptoms of a system optimized for one purpose: projecting power globally, discovering that it neglected the domestic foundation that power requires. You cannot maintain global dominance indefinitely while allowing the core to atrophy. Internationally, the challenges are structural. China isn't the Soviet Union. It's integrated into the global economy. It can't be contained through military alliances alone. The tools that worked during the Cold War don't map onto this competition. And unlike the Soviet Union, China isn't trying to export an ideology. It's offering an alternative model, authoritarian capitalism, that delivers growth without political freedom. For countries exhausted by American lectures about democracy while watching American dysfunction, that model has appeal. Not because they love authoritarianism, but because the American promise that liberal democracy produces prosperity and stability no longer seems self-evident. The dollar system, the foundation of American financial power, faces slow erosion. Not dramatic collapse, but gradual diversification. Central banks holding fewer treasuries as a percentage of reserves. More trade settled in other currencies. Cryptocurrency and digital currencies creating alternative architectures. Each change is small. The aggregate effect is the slow undermining of the privilege that allowed America to run deficits without immediate consequences. Climate change adds pressure that no empire has faced before. Mass migration, resource scarcity, extreme weather, all of which create instability that requires response. But response requires governmental capacity, international cooperation, and long-term planning, none of which come naturally to a system built on quarterly earnings, election cycles, and permanent competition. The question isn't whether America will collapse. Collapse is the wrong frame. Great powers don't disappear. They adjust, adapt, sometimes decline gracefully, sometimes thrash violently. Britain after World War II remained influential long after losing its empire. Rome continued for centuries after its peak, fragments of its power persisting through transformation. The question is what form American power takes in the coming decades. Does it retreat from global overreach and focus on domestic renewal? Does it double down on dominance, using its remaining advantages more aggressively? Does it fragment, with regions and factions pulling in different directions while the center struggles to hold? History suggests that powers built on systems rather than geography have an advantage. They can adapt, shed outdated structures, rebuild institutional capacity. But they can also become trapped by those same systems, unable to reform because too many interests depend on the status quo. America's greatest strength has always been its capacity for reinvention. The Civil War, the New Deal, the Cold War mobilization. Each was a moment when the system transformed to meet new challenges. But reinvention requires collective will, political capacity, and the ability to make short-term sacrifices for long-term survival. Whether that capacity still exists is the question this era will answer. Empires rarely collapse loudly. They fade while still calling themselves eternal. Rome didn't fall in a day. It declined across centuries, losing provinces gradually, suffering invasions it once would have crushed easily, watching its institutions hollow out while the forms remained. Observers at the time debated whether Rome was ending or merely changing. Only later did the answer become obvious. America stands at a similar threshold, though the timescale is compressed. What took Rome centuries might take decades in an interconnected world where financial crises cascade in hours and geopolitical realignments happen faster than institutions can adapt. The machinery of dominance still runs. Carrier groups still patrol oceans. Dollars still flow through global markets. Satellites still provide GPS to the world. But the system runs on momentum, on accumulated advantage, on the world's lack of alternatives. And momentum eventually runs out. The land that was discovered, claimed, built into the most powerful force in human history. That land remains. The people remain. The capacity for innovation, for reinvention, for rising to existential challenges, that capacity might still exist. But it will be tested in ways the founders never imagined, by pressures no previous generation faced, with consequences that will determine whether the American century was the beginning of something lasting or simply one more chapter in the long history of powers that peaked and then had to learn what comes after. The documentary you've just watched offered no answers because history is still being written, but it offered the questions that matter. What happens when a system built for dominance must adapt to constraint? When a nation that promised universal opportunity must confront selective failure? When a power that shaped the world according to its interests discovers that the world has interests of its own? These questions don't have comfortable answers. They have choices, and choices ultimately have consequences. The story of America isn't finished, but the story of unquestioned American dominance, that story is entering its final act. What comes next depends on decisions being made now, in boardrooms and voting booths, in military planning sessions and budget negotiations, in laboratories and classrooms and town halls. Millions of small decisions that will compound into something none of us can fully predict. The constructed empire discovered that construction requires maintenance, and maintenance requires confronting what was built. Not the myth, but the machinery. Not the promise, but the system. Not what America says it is, but what America actually does. That reckoning is no longer optional. It's here.